Welcome back to the channel where real stories prove that truth is often stranger than fiction. Tonight, we are traveling back to April of 1981, deep into the quiet mountains of Northern California, to a small community few people had ever heard of, a place called Keddie. Hidden between pine forests and dirt roads, Keddie was the kind of resort town where life moved slowly. Cabins stood close together, neighbors waved to one another, and the biggest sounds at night were the rustling trees and the whistle of the wind through the valley. It was a peaceful place, or at least it was supposed to be. In one of those cabins, Cabin 28, lived Sue Sharp, a single mother doing her best to raise 5 children on her own. She had moved to Keddie just a year earlier, looking for a fresh start after a difficult separation. Her home was simple but warm, the laughter of children, music playing from a small radio, and the smell of pine wood drifting through open windows. To anyone looking from the outside, this was a picture of an ordinary American family trying to rebuild their lives. That Saturday night, April 11th, 1981, felt like any other evening. Sue's son John, 15 years old, invited his friend Dana Wingate over to hang out. The younger kids watched TV in the back bedroom, while their mother relaxed in the living room. There was nothing unusual, nothing to suggest that this night would end in one of the most shocking, unsolved crimes in California history. Sometime after midnight, that calm mountain silence was broken not by a storm or an animal, but by something human. What exactly happened inside Cabin 28 that night is still unknown. No one in Keddie reported hearing screams or footsteps. But by the next morning, the resort would never be the same again. When the sun rose over the Sierra Nevada hills, a neighbor stopped by the Sharps' cabin and walked into a scene that even seasoned investigators would struggle to describe. Inside, 3 people had been brutally attacked, and a 4th was missing. The rest of the children, unbelievably, were still asleep in another room, unharmed. Word spread through Keddie like wildfire. How could something so violent happen in such a small, tight-knit place? Who could do this and why? For the residents, fear replaced the comfort of small-town trust. People began locking their doors, peering through curtains, wondering if the killer was still among them. The investigation that followed would stretch over decades, uncovering clues, suspects, and hidden connections, but never a final answer. Even now, more than 40 years later, the Keddie Cabin Murders remain one of America's most haunting mysteries. So tonight, we return to that quiet mountain cabin, to the shadows that still linger and the questions that never found peace. This is the story of Cabin 28, the Keddie Murders. At the heart of the Keddie case were the people who lived inside Cabin 28, an ordinary family trying to make life work in a quiet mountain town. Their names were Sue Sharp, John Sharp, Tina Sharp, and Dana Wingate, 4 lives whose stories ended too soon, and whose memories still linger in the cold mountain air. Sue Sharp was 36 years old, a mother of 5, who had moved to Keddie just a year before. Friends remembered her as independent, protective, and determined to give her children a better future. She had left an unhappy marriage in Connecticut, packed up everything she owned, and driven across the country with her kids to start over. In Keddie, she found a small, affordable cabin and took night classes, hoping to find stable work. Life was not easy, but she was making it work slowly, day by day. Her oldest son, John, was 15 tall, friendly, and outgoing. He loved music, goofing around with his siblings, and spending time with friends. That night, he had invited one of them, Dana Wingate, to stay over. Dana was 17, from a nearby town, and had known John for years. The 2 boys were close, more like brothers than friends, often helping each other through the challenges of small-town teenage life. Tina, Sue's daughter, was just 12, quiet, kind, and creative. She was the middle child, often helping her mother with the younger kids. Neighbors remembered seeing her riding her bike through the pine trails, her laughter echoing through the stillness of the forest. She had dreams of being a dancer, one-day dreams that would never come true. The night before the murders, everything seemed ordinary. Sue cooked dinner, the kids watched TV, and the older boys made plans for the next day. No one could have imagined that these would be their final hours. When morning came, only silence remained. Inside Cabin 28, investigators would later find Sue, John, and Dana victims of a brutal and chaotic attack. They were found bound with tape and cords and had suffered multiple injuries from knives and blunt weapons. There were signs of a struggle, but also something deeply personal, the kind of violence that felt driven by anger, not just by chance. Tina, however, was gone. Her bed was empty. Her shoes were missing, and for 3 long years, no one knew where she was until her remains were found miles away, deep in the woods of another county. It was a tragedy that ripped through the heart of a small community. The Sharps were not rich or powerful or famous. They were just a family, and that is what made it so terrifying. If something like this could happen to them, it could happen to anyone. When investigators entered Cabin 28 on the morning of April 12, 1981, they stepped into one of the most shocking scenes ever recorded in small-town America. What they found inside was brutal, chaotic, and deeply personal, a crime that spoke not only of violence, but of rage. The living room told the story first. Furniture was overturned, blood stained the wooden walls, and signs of a fierce struggle were everywhere. The victims, Sue Sharp, John Sharp, and Dana Wingate, had been bound with medical tape and electrical cords, as though their attacker or attackers had complete control of the situation. The violence they endured was far beyond what was needed to kill. It was frenzied, deliberate, and cruel. Both John and Dana had been struck repeatedly with a hammer-like object. One of the boys had also been strangled, the other stabbed. Sue, the mother, was found closest to the front of the room. She too had been beaten and stabbed, her body showing clear signs of resistance, as if she had fought until the very end to protect her children. Yet what haunted investigators even more was what they did not find. There were no signs of forced entry. The cabin's front door had been left slightly open, suggesting that the killer might have been invited in or was someone the family already knew. In the next room, the children's bedroom was untouched. Inside, Sue's 2 youngest sons, Rick 10 and Greg 5, along with their friend Justin Smart, had somehow slept through the entire ordeal. Whether they truly slept or were too afraid to move has never been fully proven. But they were alive, the only witnesses to one of the most horrifying nights Keddie had ever seen. For investigators, the lack of clear evidence made the case even more puzzling. No fingerprints, no obvious murder weapon, no tracks leading out into the forest. Whoever did this had taken their time, maybe even cleaned up. The only major clue was a bloody knife and a bent hammer, both found at the scene, suggesting more than one weapon had been used. Even stranger, Sue's daughter Tina was missing entirely. Her bed was empty, and her shoes and jacket were gone. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Was she taken as a witness, as a target, or had she somehow escaped? Outside, the mountain air was still cold, and neighbors gathered silently behind police tape. They could not believe that something like this had happened in their quiet resort town. The police worked for days, trying to piece together what could have led to such unimaginable violence. And as the bodies were taken away and the cabin sealed off, one thing became clear: this was not a random act. Someone had come to Cabin 28 that night with a purpose. The only question was, whose purpose and why? Of all the mysteries inside Cabin 28, none was more haunting than the disappearance of Tina Sharp. When officers finished searching the crime scene, one bed remained empty, one pair of shoes gone, and one child unaccounted for. Tina was only 12 years old, a quiet, thoughtful girl who loved drawing and looking after her younger brothers. Her absence turned an already brutal triple homicide into something even darker, a kidnapping. At first, investigators hoped she had simply fled in terror. Maybe she had run into the woods during the attack and gotten lost. The forest around Keddie was vast miles of pine, steep ravines, and abandoned logging roads. Search teams combed the area for days, calling her name through the trees, but there was no answer. Dogs lost the scent near the highway, leading police to suspect she had been taken by car. For the Sharp family and the small Keddie community, those early weeks were filled with unbearable uncertainty. Flyers with Tina's face appeared on telephone poles and in grocery stores across Northern California. Helicopters swept the valleys. Every phone call brought a flicker of hope and another dead end. As months passed, that hope began to fade. 3 long years later, in April 1984, a man scavenging for bottles in the remote woods of Butte County, roughly 50 miles from Keddie, discovered something unusual: fragments of a human skull and jawbone. The remains were later confirmed by dental records to belong to Tina Sharp. Nearby, investigators found a blue nylon jacket, a blanket, and a small child's clothing. Whoever had taken her had made sure she would never be found alive. The discovery reopened old wounds and raised new questions. Why had Tina been removed from the cabin while the others were left behind? Was she the target all along, or had she witnessed something the killer could not risk leaving behind? Some theorized that she had known the attacker personally, someone familiar enough to lure her into leaving quietly. Even decades later, her disappearance continues to puzzle both detectives and true crime researchers. The location of her remains suggested that whoever took her knew the wilderness well. But the motive remained a void. Without solid forensic evidence, every theory felt like a whisper in the wind, chilling, but unproven. For the surviving Sharp children, Tina's absence left a scar that never healed. Her mother's protective warmth, her brother's laughter, all gone in a single night. What remained was silence, unanswered questions, and a child whose story was never finished. As investigators would later admit, finding Tina changed everything. What had once been a triple homicide was now a quadruple murder, one that spanned both space and time, connecting 2 isolated scenes under the same cold shadow. And with that revelation, one thing became clear: the mystery of Keddie was no longer confined to Cabin 28. It had escaped into the mountains. Amid the horror that unfolded inside Cabin 28, there was one inexplicable detail: 3 children survived. While their mother, brother, and sister were gone, Rick 10 years old, Greg 5 years old, and their friend Justin Smart somehow made it through the night untouched. They had been sleeping in the small bedroom at the back of the cabin. The thin wooden wall that separated them from the chaos in the living room offered little real protection, and yet not a single mark was found on them. When a neighbor entered the next morning, the boys were awake, frightened, but alive, unaware of the nightmare that had taken place only a few feet away. At first, investigators thought the children had slept through everything. But as time went on, Justin Smart's story began to change. Justin was the son of Marilyn and Martin Smart, who lived just 2 cabins away. Under hypnosis, he later claimed that he might have seen part of the attack in a dream, or perhaps something more than a dream. According to his account, he saw Sue Sharp talking with 2 men in the living room. One wore glasses. The other had long hair. The men were arguing with John and Dana. Then things turned violent. Justin said one of the men struck Dana with a hammer, while the other attacked Sue. The details were fragmented and eerie, the kind of story a terrified child might tell after witnessing something his mind could not fully understand. Police took the hypnosis session seriously, but it raised more questions than answers. Were Justin's memories real, or a blend of fear and suggestion? If they were real, how had the killers spared the boys in the next room? Why would someone commit such brutal murders but leave witnesses alive? In the following days, the surviving boys were sent to stay with relatives, shielded from the media frenzy that engulfed Keddie. For Rick and Greg, life would never return to normal. They had lost their mother, their brother, and their sister all at once. The cabin, once their home, became a place of nightmares. For Justin, the trauma was twofold. His father, Marty Smart, soon became one of the main suspects. That meant every time the case was discussed, his family's name was dragged back into the shadows of suspicion. What truly happened in that cabin room remains uncertain. Whether the boys heard whispers, footsteps, or cries that night may never be known. But their survival turned the Keddie case from simple tragedy into something much stranger, a story where witnesses lived. Yet the truth still refused to come out. Decades later, as new evidence emerged, investigators would return again and again to the question of those three boys and what they might have seen or remembered in the darkness of Cabin 28. When crime scene investigators began documenting the evidence inside Cabin 28, one thing quickly stood out: the sheer brutality of the attack. It was not just the number of wounds, but the variety of weapons used. Whoever carried out the murders came prepared, and they came with rage. Lying near the victims were two key items: a bent claw hammer and a blood-stained knife. The knife's blade was so severely damaged that it appeared to have been used far beyond its breaking point. That detail, more than anything, revealed the nature of the crime: personal, uncontrolled, and furious. Later reports indicated that a second knife might have been used, and possibly a rifle, butt, or heavy object for the blunt force trauma seen on the victims. Investigators also noticed that a hammer was missing from the tool set belonging to one of Sue's neighbors, a man named Marty Smart, who would soon become central to the investigation. The victims' bindings told another story. They were tied up with medical tape and electrical cords, materials commonly found in local homes, not professional restraints. This suggested that the killer or killers had not planned the murders down to every detail. They might have entered the cabin with only a general intention, improvising as the situation escalated. But despite the amount of blood and physical struggle, no clear fingerprints were found on the weapons that hinted at gloves or careful cleanup. Some officers believe the attacker may have stayed long enough after the killings to wipe down surfaces, rearrange objects, and make the scene appear confusing. Others thought it was simply the chaos of multiple people acting at once. One disturbing theory emerged: that two killers were involved, one restraining victims, the other delivering the fatal blows. The pattern of injuries supported that idea. It would also explain how multiple people in the cabin could have been controlled at once without signs of forced entry or loud struggle being heard outside. Years later, in 2016, a hammer matching the description of Marty Smart's missing tool was recovered from a nearby pond, heavily rusted, but still identifiable. It was consistent with one of the murder weapons. This find reignited interest in the case, suggesting that the killers might have disposed of evidence locally, assuming it would never be found in the depths of the forest. Still, without usable DNA from the weapons at the time, the case remained stuck in uncertainty. The physical tools of the crime were in hand, but the people who used them were still faceless. Each piece of evidence seemed to whisper the same thing: this was not random. The violence was deliberate, the rage personal. And the missing hammer, resurfacing decades later, was a silent reminder that even the deepest secrets of the forest can eventually come back to light. But for investigators, The next question was crucial. Who owned that rage, and why did it end at Cabin 28? When word spread about the Keddie murders, local authorities rushed to the scene, but what happened next would shape the case's failures for decades. The Plumas County Sheriff's Department, a small rural force unaccustomed to violent crimes, was suddenly faced with one of the most gruesome multiple homicides in California history. The investigators were overwhelmed, and from the very first day, mistakes began to multiply. Officers entered Cabin 28 without wearing protective gear, unintentionally trampling through evidence. Neighbors and curious locals wandered near the scene before it was fully secured. Footprints were smudged, blood patterns disturbed, and potential DNA, though the term was barely known in 1981, was forever lost. The surviving children were removed safely, but in the chaos, few initial statements were properly documented. The investigators did their best with what they had, but the pressure was enormous. News of the crime hit the regional press almost immediately, turning the tiny resort community into a media circus. Every reporter wanted an angle, every rumor became fact, and every misstep by law enforcement widened the cracks in the case. Within days, the FBI was briefly consulted, but the local sheriff's office insisted on retaining control. This decision would later be criticized, as national expertise could have preserved crucial forensic clues. Evidence was collected but poorly cataloged. One of the most shocking oversights was that the cabin was cleaned and later rented out before the full investigation was complete, erasing what might have been key trace materials. Witness interviews also left lingering questions. Several residents recalled hearing muffled noises that night, perhaps arguments or a scream, yet no one had called the police. Others said they saw unfamiliar cars near the resort after dark, but their reports were vague. With each passing day, leads went cold. Then there were the suspects. From the start, Marty Smart and his roommate John Bobade drew attention. They lived nearby. Both had questionable reputations, and Marty's stepson Justin had been inside the Sharp cabin that night. Yet, despite circumstantial evidence and inconsistencies in Marty's statements, no arrests were made. Part of the problem lay in how small and interconnected Keddie was. Everyone knew everyone else, and rumors often carried more weight than facts. Personal relationships blurred professional lines. It was said that Marty was friendly with the sheriff, a connection that may have discouraged deeper investigation at the time. By summer 1981, the case had already begun to stall. Leads were exhausted, physical evidence limited, and the sense of urgency faded as other local matters took precedence. What should have been a meticulously handled crime scene turned into a mystery clouded by confusion and missed opportunities. Years later, when new detectives revisited the case, they found boxes of misplaced files, untested evidence, and half-finished reports. It was as if the truth had been buried not only under time, but under the weight of neglect. And as the 1980s turned to the 1990s, the Keddie murders quietly slipped into legend, a cold case frozen in failure, waiting for someone to dig it up again. As investigators sifted through the fragments of evidence, one name began to surface again and again: Marty Smart. He was a neighbor of the Sharp family, a man who lived just a few cabins away with his wife, Marilyn, and her young son, Justin, the same boy who had been asleep in Cabin 28 the night of the murders. Marty was known around Keddie as volatile and unpredictable. He worked as a cook at the local lodge and was often described as moody, sometimes cruel. According to those who knew him, he had a temper that could ignite over the smallest things. After the murders, his behavior raised more than a few eyebrows. He suddenly left Keddie and moved out of state, claiming he could not handle the attention from investigators. But there was more. In the months following the murders, Marty allegedly confessed to a counselor at the Veterans Administration Hospital that he had committed the killings. That confession was reportedly shared with authorities, and yet nothing was done. The file was marked, then quietly shelved. There was also his roommate, John Beau Babade, a man with a criminal record and rumored ties to organized crime. Beau had arrived in Keddie only weeks before the murders, after being released from a Chicago prison. He was much older than Marty and was said to have influenced him heavily. Witnesses described Beau as manipulative, possibly dangerous, and oddly uninterested in the investigation that followed. Adding to suspicion, a hammer belonging to Marty went missing right after the killings, the same kind of hammer believed to have been used in the attack. Decades later, in 2016, a matching hammer was discovered in a nearby pond. But back in 1981, this detail was not pursued. Then there was Marilyn Smart, Marty's wife. In later interviews, she claimed her husband had confessed to her on the night of the murders that he had killed Sue because she had been trying to convince Marilyn to leave him. Marilyn said she had gone to the sheriff with this information, but the report mysteriously vanished. Despite multiple connections, a missing hammer, a confession, a motive, and the presence of Marty's stepson at the scene, no charges were ever filed. Marty died in 2000, and Beau had already passed away years earlier. When detectives revisited the case, they found that several pieces of evidence pointing to the Smart connection had been either lost or ignored. It was one of the most baffling elements of the case, how two men so close to the victims, both with suspicious behavior and circumstantial evidence linking them to the crime, could slip through the cracks of justice. To this day, many who have studied the case believe the Keddie murders were not a mystery of who, but of why the truth was buried. And when new investigators reopened the files decades later, they found something that would reignite the entire case: traces of DNA that did not belong to the victims. Every murder leaves behind not only evidence, but intent, the why that investigators chase long after the physical clues have gone cold. In the case of the Keddie Cabin Murders, the motive was as elusive as the killer. Nothing was stolen, the victims had no known enemies, and there were no signs of sexual assault or robbery. Whoever committed this crime had not come for money. They had come for something or someone else. Early on, detectives suspected a personal motive. The level of violence, the repeated strikes, the bindings, and the rage behind every wound suggested that the killer knew at least one of the victims. This was not random. It was intimate. And the focus of that rage seemed to be Sue Sharp. Sue had built a reputation in Keddie as a strong, independent woman, qualities that some admired, but others resented. She had reportedly been advising her neighbor, Marilyn Smart, to leave her abusive husband, Marty. If that was true, it could have driven Marty into a spiral of anger. In a later statement, Marilyn herself claimed Marty once told her, "I paid the price for what she did." Many now believe that was his way of admitting to the crime without saying it directly. Another theory revolved around revenge or humiliation. Some suggested that John and Dana might have gotten into a confrontation earlier that night, possibly with locals or with older men from town. They had been seen hitchhiking and might have crossed paths with the wrong people, but there was never concrete proof. There were also whispers of something larger, a drug-related connection involving Beau Babade, Marty's roommate and ex-convict. Beau was rumored to have ties to organized crime and may have been involved in illegal activities in the area. Some theorists proposed that the murders were meant as a message or cleanup related to something Sue had witnessed or refused to participate in. Then came the psychological motive theory. Perhaps the killers did not come to Keddie with a plan to murder, but a heated argument spiraled out of control. The electrical cords and tape suggested improvisation. Once the violence began, panic might have taken over, and in that chaos, the situation turned fatal. Even decades later, new investigators have admitted that the emotional intensity of the crime makes sense only if the killer had a personal grievance against Sue. Everything else, John's and Dana's deaths, Tina's abduction, may have been tragic collateral damage. But what makes this case endure is the emptiness of that why. The motive feels close enough to grasp, yet always out of reach, buried under half-truths, lost reports, and decades of silence. In the end, it is possible the real motive was not complicated at all. It might have been jealousy, anger, or control, the ordinary human emotions that, when twisted, become something monstrous. And in Keddie, those emotions did not just destroy one family. They destroyed a community's sense of safety forever. By the mid-1980s, the Keddie murders had already begun to fade from national headlines. Years passed, leads dried up, and witnesses scattered. What had once been one of California's most shocking crimes slowly turned into a cold case, a haunting file that gathered dust in a small town evidence room. The official investigation stalled almost immediately after the initial flurry of interviews and searches. Detectives retired or were reassigned, reports were misplaced, and physical evidence sat untested for decades. DNA analysis, which could have cracked the case, simply did not exist in 1981. By the time technology advanced far enough, many of the original samples had degraded. The Plumas County Sheriff's Office periodically revisited the case, but with limited staff and shrinking budgets, progress was slow. The remaining Sharp children, now adults, continued to ask questions, determined not to let their family be forgotten. Every few years, the case would resurface in newspapers or on TV documentaries, each time reigniting public interest, each time ending in the same painful uncertainty. In the 1990s, the California Department of Justice briefly reviewed the files, but found little new evidence. The case remained technically open, but effectively dormant. Keddie itself changed too. The once busy resort community grew quieter, cabins were abandoned, and time seemed to swallow the tragedy whole. Cabin 28, where the murders took place, stood for years as a decaying reminder of the horror, windows boarded, walls stained with memories no one wanted to revisit. By the early 2000s, the case was nearly forgotten outside of true crime circles. Then, in 2008, a new sheriff, Greg Hagwood, took office in Plumas County. He had grown up in the same area and remembered the case vividly. For him, this was not just another file, it was personal. Hagwood reopened the investigation, assembling a small team of determined detectives and crime analysts to re-examine every surviving piece of evidence. What they found was startling. Many files had never been processed properly. Some reports had gone missing entirely, while others were found tucked in boxes that had not been opened in decades. It was as if parts of the truth had been intentionally buried. Old interviews, when reviewed under a modern lens, revealed inconsistencies that had been overlooked at the time. In 2013, the old Cabin 28 was finally demolished. The structure had become a symbol of fear and decay too painful for the community to preserve. Yet even after the cabin was gone, the case refused to die. Each time the sheriff's office announced new reviews, it stirred a familiar question among residents. Would this be the time they finally solved it? By then, the Keddie murders had crossed from tragedy into folklore, a ghost story told in whispers about a family destroyed, justice denied, and a killer who walked away unseen. But that was about to change, because soon new technology and an old clue would breathe life back into the coldest case in Plumas County. In the decades that followed, the story of Cabin 28 seemed frozen in time until a discovery in the 2010s reignited the investigation. For the first time in years, the cold silence surrounding the Keddie murders began to crack. In 2016, a local man stumbled upon something in a shallow pond near the old resort grounds, a rusted claw hammer. Its handle corroded, but still recognizable. When investigators examined it, they realized it matched the exact description of a hammer that had gone missing from Marty Smart's tool collection back in 1981. It was a kind of discovery that chills even seasoned detectives. A weapon lying in wait for 35 years, hidden only a few miles from a murder scene. For Sheriff Greg Hagwood and Special Investigator Mike Gamberg, this was the break they had been waiting for. Gamberg had known the Sharp family personally. He had even coached the Sharp boys in school sports. To him, this was not just another file, it was unfinished business. The hammer was sent for forensic testing, and although the passage of time had degraded much of the material, trace DNA and material residues offered new leads. At around the same time, detectives uncovered a sealed envelope in an old evidence box. Inside was a recorded 911 call made in 1980 for the year Tina Sharp's remains were discovered. In the call, an unidentified male voice calmly told authorities that the skull found near Camp 18 belonged to Tina. The chilling part, this call was made before police had even confirmed the identity of the remains. Whoever the caller was, he knew more than he should have. Then came the biggest development: DNA testing. Modern techniques allowed investigators to re-examine pieces of tape, clothing, and other preserved evidence from the original crime scene. One sample, taken from a piece of adhesive tape near the victims, did not match any of the family members. Instead, it belonged to an unidentified male, someone who was still alive. Sheriff Hagwood publicly stated that the DNA evidence was consistent with someone who was known to the original investigation. Though he did not reveal names, many suspected it pointed once again toward Marty Smart or someone close to him. As these discoveries came to light, public interest surged once more. True crime communities online began re-examining every detail, comparing witness statements, and mapping out possible timelines. Even television networks revisited the story, producing documentaries that brought new attention to Keddie. For the first time in decades, it felt like the truth was within reach. And yet, the deeper investigators dug, the more they realized how tangled the web had become: missing records, overlooked confessions, and people who had died before they could speak. Still, these new breakthroughs proved one thing: the case was not forgotten. Beneath years of silence, the evidence had waited patiently for the world to catch up. And as forensic science advanced, it carried with it the promise that perhaps, after 40 years, the victims of Cabin 28 might finally get their answer. More than 40 years have passed since the night of April 11, 1981, yet the shadow of Cabin 28 still lingers over the pine forests of Keddie. The case that began as a brutal small-town murder has evolved into something larger, a haunting symbol of justice delayed, of secrets that refuse to stay buried. Despite the new discoveries, the hammer, the DNA, the forgotten 911 called the Keddie Cabin Murders remain unsolved. Investigators believe they are closer than ever, but the passage of time has created an invisible wall between the past and the present. Witnesses have died. Memories have faded. Evidence has decayed. And yet, the story continues to breathe. Every so often, new pieces of information surface. Anonymous tips arrive in letters or phone calls. Retired detectives revisit their notes. Online communities of amateur sleuths dissect every photo, every document, every rumor, hoping to find the missing thread. But the truth still slips through their fingers like fog in the mountains. For many, the tragedy of Keddie is not just about the violence that occurred that night, but about the system that failed. How could so much evidence be mishandled? How could potential confessions be ignored? And how could a case with this much detail, witnesses, suspects, and physical proof still remain unresolved. Modern investigators have publicly stated their belief that 2 or more people were involved, and that the case is solvable. The DNA profiles they now possess could one day link to someone through genealogical databases, the same technique that has solved countless cold cases in recent years. It is a race between technology and time. Meanwhile, the Sharp family continues to live with what was taken from them. Survivors rarely speak to the media, but when they do, their message is simple: they deserve justice. Cabin 28 was demolished years ago, but its absence only deepened the wound. The clearing where it once stood remains quiet grass and trees reclaiming the ground where so much was lost. Some locals still refuse to talk about the murders. Others visit the site in silence, leaving flowers or notes. And when the wind moves through the trees, you can almost hear the question that has echoed through Keddie for over 4 decades. Who did this and why? Perhaps one day science will give that answer. Or perhaps the truth lies buried forever, known only to the mountains that witnessed it. But one thing is certain: the story of the Keddie Cabin Murders endures because it touches something deeply human. Our need to understand what drives people to destroy, and our refusal to forget the victims who never got their peace. In the end, the case stands as both tragedy and warning, a reminder that even in the most peaceful places, darkness can find a way in. And sometimes it never truly leaves. The story of the Keddie Cabin Murders is one that refuses to rest, a case frozen in time, yet still alive in whispers, theories, and unanswered questions. More than 4 decades have passed, and still, the truth remains just out of reach. For investigators, the Keddie case became more than a mystery, it became a warning. It showed how fragile justice can be when the smallest mistakes compound over time, when evidence is mishandled, and when fear overshadows diligence. A single night of violence turned into 40 years of confusion, silence, and pain. For the Sharp family, that pain never truly faded. A mother who only wanted safety for her children. A teenage son and his friend whose futures were stolen before they began. A little girl whose laughter vanished into the forest. And 3 young boys who had to grow up haunted by a night they barely survived. What makes the Keddie murders so haunting is not just the brutality, it is the unfinished story. There is enough evidence to form a picture, but too many missing pieces to see it clearly. Every discovery, the rusted hammer, the anonymous 911 call, the unknown DNA, feels like another knock at a door that still won't open. Perhaps one day, technology or confession will break that silence. Perhaps a relative, a DNA match, or an overlooked report will finally reveal the name behind the horror. But even if that happens, the real weight of this case lies not in who did it, but in the lives it changed, and the reminder that evil can hide in the most ordinary places. Keddie was supposed to be a peaceful mountain escape, a fresh start for a struggling family. Instead, it became a monument to what happens when truth slips through human hands. So tonight, as we close the file on Cabin 28, we remember that behind every mystery, there are faces, names, and families still waiting for peace. Justice delayed is still justice worth fighting for. And until the day it arrives, the story of the Keddie murders will remain exactly what it has always been: a shadow in the pines, a question without an answer, and a silence that refuses to fade. Thank you for watching. If you'd like more stories like this, real cases, real mysteries, and real people, do not forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.